Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever the time might happen to be for you. This is your study guide for World War II, the Pacific War, 1941 to 1945. Admiral Yamamoto was the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. The Japanese code words, which meant that surprise attack had been achieved at Pearl Harbor, were Tora, Tora, Tora. After the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States assessed the damages and immediately began salvage operations. Now, when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, most of the U.S. sailors were preparing for liberty. The Japanese targets there at Pearl Harbor were pre-designated to strike all parts of the harbor at once. During the Japanese attack, one U.S. battleship exploded after a bomb set off her ammunition magazines. That ship was the USS Arizona. Aircraft carriers were out to sea during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Specifically, we'll talk about which aircraft carriers we're talking about later, but you should just know that those were the major combatant vessels that were out to sea at the time. At Pearl Harbor, the fuel tank farm, repair yards, and machine shops were not destroyed, and that allowed the U.S. to resume naval operations relatively soon after the attack. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. really had no choice but to build their offense in the Pacific around the United States Marine Corps. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese felt they had established superiority. Let's talk a little bit about some people and some other things now. The name of the U.S. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet was Admiral Chester Nimitz. The American General MacArthur, it's Douglas MacArthur, was ordered out of the Philippines in March of 1942 to take command of the defense of Australia. The Japanese made Truk in the Carolines into their Pearl Harbor, if you will. Anyway, we'll talk about that in class. The key to America's offense in the Pacific was U.S. intelligence, our ability basically to break their codes and to know what they were going to be doing without them realizing that we knew what they were going to be doing. One advantage that the Japanese had at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942 was simply that their pilots had more combat experience. Now, the turning point in the Pacific War came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. At that point, it definitely looked like the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, were going to be able to defeat the Japanese. Doolittle, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, led a force of all volunteer pilots in a raid against Tokyo in April of 1942. Elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, the Japanese perimeter was anchored by Rangoon, Burma. On the south, the Japanese perimeter included the Dutch East Indies, also known as Indonesia. The first great combat between carrier forces, with neither fleet ever coming into sight of the other, was the Battle of the Coral Sea. The primary cause of Japan's ultimate defeat at sea was the loss of her most experienced pilots. Again, air power was critical, sea-based air power in particular, and Japan was just losing too many pilots. The island of Guadalcanal, which is in the Solomon Islands, became the objective of both sides following the battle at Midway. Now, the passage between the major Solomon Islands and Rabaul was nicknamed the Slot. The worst, pardon my typo there, the worst defeat in U.S. naval history occurred off Savo Island. The Seabees are a specially trained force that developed Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. As we all know, I hope at this point, the Seabees are basically construction battalions. During the battles for Guadalcanal and New Guinea in late 1942, Rabaul was the major Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific. During World War II, the Japanese occupied American territory up in the Aleutian Islands, near Alaska. One goal for the Pacific War following the Casablanca Conference of January 1943 was to isolate Rabaul. The Japanese headquarters in the Marshall Islands, their headquarters were at Truk. The Japanese were defeated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The principal effect of this defeat on the Japanese was that their remaining carrier air capability was destroyed. We talked a lot about submarines when we were talking about the Atlantic War. Now, the size of submarines used in the Pacific was significantly different from the ones used in the Atlantic. It's just something to know. Following the victory in the Marianas Islands, the Fifth Fleet was redesignated the U.S. Third Fleet. Regarding the invasion of the Central Philippines, Admiral Halsey sent Admiral Nimitz an urgent message. In that message, he recommended that the Palaos and Yap be bypassed and that ground forces be turned over to MacArthur. The Pacific War Island Campaign at Peleliu cost the U.S. Marines the highest combat casualty rate of any amphibious assault in American history, a rate of 40%. The Third Fleet conducted heavy attacks on Formosa and Okinawa to destroy potential land-based air support for the Japanese forces in the Philippines. The Japanese objective in Leyte Gulf was to destroy the amphibious task force, thereby stopping the amphibious landing. The outcome of the battles for Leyte Gulf was that the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer existed as an effective fighting force. Kamikazes appeared for the first time in the Pacific War at Leyte Gulf. Iwo Jima, held by the Japanese, allowed the home island defenses to be alerted when American bombers were headed for Japan. Mount Suribachi is the famous mountain located on Iwo Jima. President Truman gave the final order to drop atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The USSR, that's the Soviet Union, did not declare war on Japan until after the first atomic bomb was dropped. They knew if they wanted to get in on the peace talks, they'd have to actually declare war, so they did there at the very, very last minute. Admiral Nimitz signed the surrender document acceptance for the United States. The surrender document was signed aboard the USS Missouri. General MacArthur directed the occupation of Japan from his headquarters in Tokyo. The USS Lexington and the USS Enterprise were out at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, probably saving them from being destroyed. The last major battle of the Pacific War was at Okinawa. The name Tokyo Express was given to the Japanese operations that attempted to reinforce Guadalcanal. The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. We talked about that just a few minutes ago. During World War II, little effort went into improving or training in the Japanese submarine fleet. The Japanese made their initial peace feelers to end the Pacific War to the Soviet Union. The ABDA Defense Command, or the ABDA Defense Command, was formed by the United States, the British, the Dutch, and Australia. And that's America is the first A. The British, of course, the Dutch, meaning the Netherlands, is the actual country, and Australia. Finally, for your study guide, Java in the Dutch East Indies was the primary objective of the Japanese. They freed it from Dutch colonial rule, only to subjugate it themselves. All right.